Okay, so the project of the CRS is basically something like that. We have 5 or 6 main use cases. I'm going to implement the first part, which is the login system. The login system is considered the first use case, the second, and the third. Creating or sign up, create an account, log in, log out. These three are going to be left. I'm going to create these without any ACB pattern, and after that I'm going to refactor it into ACB. After we do this first part, which is the login system, I'm going to do the rest of the classes, the movies and the reservation class, because it's going to be a little bit more complicated. When I did this project, I thought that's going to be simple, but when I finished it, I found it was really big, and I know that you are trying to work on your project, the chatbot as well. So in the purpose or in the goal of not giving you directly the answers, I'm going to give you something that is really simple as possible, which conveys the same approach that you need to follow in order to implement your chatbot via the ACB pattern or via any object-oriented approach, right? So I'm going to give you videos for the first part, which is the login system, which is gonna be covering the first 3 use cases. If you understood this, then this is really enough for you to embark and do the same stuff in your project, in your chatbot project. And I'm going to upload the rest of the videos for these 3 use cases later. Okay, so as you can see here, the user can create an account, log in, log out. He can view the movies, he can reserve a movie, he can view his reservations. Now note that the create account and the reserve movie actually eventually is going to update records in the database. Like let's say that we have a database for the accounts, for every account we have a table for accounts, right? We have a JSON file for accounts, the multiple dictionaries. Okay, so whenever we create an account for a specific user, we actually update these accounts in that database. Okay, so database gets updated. Okay, whenever we reserve a movie, this reservation needs to be recorded. It needs to be traced. What happens if for some reason, I made for example, something like I want a refund, or I'm not going to attend that movie in the cinema, or maybe I want to change that timing for some reason. So the administrator of the system needs to go back to that reservation ID that you have made, which should be stored in the database. That's why whenever you reserve a movie, it is required for you to update it as the developer who is developing the system. It requires you to save that reservation with a specific reservation number, with a specific username, a specific, for example, movie name, movie ID inside the database. So note that all of these login is going to check. That's why I didn't say include here. It's not gonna update the records. It's just gonna check the database. The logout is going to just log out, right? So it's going to set some values, set the username, password, and email into none, for example, right? And view movies is going to check the database, right? And it's going to return the movies that are there and provided or display them to the user. View reservation is going to check as well the database. Okay, so these do not actually add anything to the database. They do not write, or they do not need me to write any specific or additional data in the database. But this creation of account, or this creation of the reservation, actually needs me to update them. So let's take the first 3 use cases. Okay, let's go to Lucidchart here. Now let's say that, for example, let's say that this is your file. All right, so let's consider that this is the let's call it accounts. What do we call it? JSON? Do we call it data, or do we call it accounts? Let's just call it data. Okay, or accounts data. The JSON. Okay, so this is the JSON file. Okay, you've seen me in the videos, in the previous videos, before we get to the part where we actually take classes and object-oriented. You've seen me put that account.json or that intents, if you remember, intents and entities dictionary that I made, which it wasn't really a dictionary. It was a list of tuples, or I don't know, I don't really remember. It was a tuple of tuples, or a list of tuples, something like that, or a list of tuples that contains lists, something like this. Anyways, that intents entities .py that I've used inside in the previous videos, and I remember in week 3 or something, That was for the purpose of illustrating a point, which is basically if you want to have your actual data inside your Py script, inside your Python script, that's fine. But on the long run, that's not gonna be any practical, because on the long run, imagine you have a database. Like for example, let's say like a database like that contains data for like 1,000 intents or 1,000 entities, or a database for that contains 10,000 accounts. So having this as a dynamic variable or a dynamic value inside your code, it's way too much. It's way too much space to be included into a Python script. And that's why the topic of data persistence appears. That's why we are going to do something that's called data persistence. Data persistence is basically addressing the storage of the data, meaning that if we have some data, whether this data is a dictionary, a list, or whatever, we would want to store it in a file, and we would want to have some kind of functions, a couple of functions that interact with that data, that interact with that dictionary, that interacts with that list of tuples or list of dictionaries, like intents or intents entities that we have created in the project session, right? And instead of having the actual data directly in my script, I want to store it in a file, and I want to have some kind of interaction between this file and the actual interface. So I want to make an interface, right? Something that actually interfaces me with the file, something that, and instead of having the actual data file or the actual dictionary inside my script, I want to create some kind of a class, some kind of an interface that I can use to read from that file. Or if I want to update, maybe some account has been created, so I want to update that account, right? So that's the whole point of using what we call an interface for that data persistence, or the interface for that file format. Okay, this is what we call data persistence. It's basically storing the data in an actual file format and having some kind of a script, right, to interact with that file format. Having some kind of a script, maybe it's this script is a Python script, maybe the script contains only functions, maybe the script is a class, who knows? But we have a class, a script that is actually interfacing, that is actually interacting with that file format that contains our data, which is considered as the database in this case. Okay, so let's say that this is my database. Okay, so this is considered my DB, or part of the DB. Let's say that this is a table in the database. For your information, a database can contain multiple tables. Like we can have a big database that contains a table for accounts, that contains a table for something like posts that you've made, a table for likes that you have made, a table for comments that you have made, a table for let's say friends that you have on Facebook. So we can have multiple tables. So let's consider that this is table 1, which is basically the accounts, the data, or accounts data.json. So what is account data.json? I don't know. Let's just make it for simplicity. Let's just call it data.json. Okay. So I'm gonna take this approach whenever I work. So what I will do is the following. Let's go to where did we open it? This is the folder that we are working in, CRS version 3. What I will do is the following. Whenever I create something, I'm not going to create this in a Python script, but instead any class that I will create, I'm going to first create it in my Jupyter notebook and test it, and then put it in a Python script. I think this is easier to maintain. So let's say that this is the actual, let's say that the account is or the data.json is going to be something like that. It's gonna be something like this. Okay, so let's just call this for example accounts. Okay, you know what, let's just call this account data, or accounts data. All right, so this is the file, this is the database. Whenever an account is being created, For example, let's say that someone is called Lloyd or Loai مثلا has been created. So the username was gonna be Loai, something like that. And Loai enters some password. So the password's gonna be like that. Loai enters some that's a very lame name, to be honest. But whatever. So I entered his mail like that, right? And that's another object or another dictionary that has been created whenever that specific user, who's Luai in this case, created his account. So this is account Luai's account, right? So what is reservation? Reservation, you can neglect it for the time being. Reservation is going to be addressing the second part of the system, which is basically movies and reservation stuff. So I'm having a variable that is called reservation for every person, where if that person actually, if for example, if Ahmed مثلا made a reservation, this reservation object is going to be stored inside that reservation list. Okay, so I'm just going to leave it empty for the time being. Okay, so this is my, let's start the database with just one client or just one user. Okay, so let's use our notice that now let's say that we are going to use the JSON dot dump. First of all, let's open up my text manager. So open data.json with the purpose of writing, and I'm going to dump that accounts, this list of dictionaries here, into that file. I forgot as a file like this. And let's take a look at data.json. And this is the actual list of dictionaries. This is the actual accounts. This is the current accounts that we have in the system. We only have one person. Maybe this is the administrator. Who knows, right? Okay. So now let's create the interface. Let's create the layer, the actual interface, or the data persistence or data management, or what we call a database management layer. Okay, so I'm going to address this whenever after we finished it, but this layer is intended to be something as what we call a DBMS. In the next semester, you're gonna take database, you're gonna take database systems, and you're gonna see that in database system we have a database like that. We have a database that has multiple tables. Maybe have a database that has table 1, which is, for example, the accounts data. Maybe it has another table which has something like the movies data, and we have another table in the same database that is, for example, called table 3, that has something like reservations data, right? So we have multiple tables inside the same database. So we have someone that is called the database management system. Okay, that database management system is the actual link between me and these actual data files. All of these are data files. All of these are just files, right? When we're talking database, the format of the file is actually, most of the time it's SQL, it's SQL, right? It's not JSON here. But bottom line is that all of these are data files. You do not interact with the data file directly. All right, you do not interact with the data files or the tables or the JSON files or the CSVs or the text files directly. You use a what we call a DBMS layer, like something that handles the interaction between these three people right there, right? I'm going to make some arrows. These arrows are completely wrong. They are not UML at all. There is no notation for it. I just want to make a point here that all of these, this is not dependency, by the way. I'm just saying, I'm trying to say that this database management system is going to interact with the data files or the tables that I have in the system. Okay. Okay. So this DBMS is going to interact with that table or that table or that table. Okay, so the database management system or any database management system does three more things or four main things, which is basically reading from the database and updating the database, right? And maybe writing some new stuff. Updating, we mean by that editing some stuff, okay? Or by writing, we actually mean creating new stuff or deleting. And these actually form what we call the actual CRUD operations. Okay, so any database system should be able to let you read from these files or let you update any of these files or let you create a new entry in any of these files or let you delete any entry of any of these files. Okay, so these are the main functionalities that I'm going to implement in my interface class, right? This interface class, this is my actual gateway into these files. So I cannot, to emphasize of the principle of data persistence, I cannot enter the actual files directly, but I need an interface, I need a gateway that has these functionalities that let me read from the file, that let me update something in the file, that let me create something in the file, that let me delete something from the file. Of course, I'm going to address the first three. We're not gonna talk about delete now. Okay, so that means that this interface that's gonna work as a DBMS or a database management system or a database management layer. Let's call this a, let's make it a class, since everything in a class diagram is classes, right? Anything is a class in class diagram. So let's call this database management system something like stored files, right? So stored files should have a couple of variables, and I'm going to discuss them with you in a minute. But for the time being, let's agree that stored files should be, which is my gateway that works as the database management system, should let me read from that file. So I should have a method that is called read. It should let me update these values in a file. It should let me, for example, write into these files, and I'm going to add something that is called search. That's something from me, like as an extra addition like that. Okay, and these should not be class variables, right? So what are the parameters here? So as we have been saying so far, we said that we are going to use a class that is going to interact with the database. Notice that we do not, as I told you, like in just a couple of seconds, you're gonna see me do something like this. You're gonna see me create an account class. Since if you remember the use cases that I showed you, we have in this cinema reservation system, we have create account, we have login, we have logout, and I believe I showed you the JSON file. So the JSON file was something like this. So this is my database. It is a list of dictionaries, right? And the first dictionary corresponds to a user. It corresponds to a row or to a row in a table that's inside the database. And this row has this is the first column of the row, right? So username. The second column is the password. The next column or the third is email. The fourth column is reservation. So this is basically a row inside a very big table. This table is consistent of these accounts. So this table or the data or accounts data.json, this is the table for the users or the table for the accounts. Okay, so this is my data file or my database file. Okay, so in a matter of seconds, you're gonna see me. I have to create something like account, right? I need to create a class that is called account, and this account will typically contain the same data that any user would have. Like whenever I create some user, any user is going to have a username, a password, an email, and a couple of reservation, or let's call this reserved movies, right? So I even call this here reserved movies, right? So whenever I create an account, I should have these following values or variables: password, email, and we have, what do we have else? I think we should have a flag if the user is logged in or not, true or false. We should have something like a reserved movies. All right. So in a matter of seconds, I'm going to create this account class. Of course, this is just conceptual. I'm just writing this in front of you to illustrate a point, which is that the main point is, don't say that inside my account class, right, or inside my account object, I'm not going to need any of this, and I'm going just to take my account.json file and place it inside that object, right? That's wrong. I know that this is the entity, this is the model here. Remember, entities and models are the same aliases. Entities or models typically refer to things that get stored inside, that refers to data that gets stored inside your database. So inside your database, what gets stored? Well, I know that if I have an account, so there is an account, some account information, as you're seeing, is going to be stored inside the database, like the account information that you're seeing here. Okay, so this is a list of dictionaries that I've just created, right? Maybe your list of dictionaries or maybe the accounts.json in your system need only something like a username to log in. That's it. It doesn't need all of these kind of things, right? Maybe it's simpler than that. So you are the one who sets the actual structure of the table inside your database or inside your file, right? And typically what we do is that we do not use that data.json inside the class. We do not use it inside the class, but instead we use what we call an interface, right? So if the account class wanted to, for example, check on some info, if the account wanted to check on another information in the data.json, right? It needs to go through the gateway, right? First, it needs to go to the interface first, right? So the entity or the model should not be able to interact with the actual data file directly, but instead the entity should be able to interact first with the interface of that data file. Like every data file should have an interface, and that interface is denoted by the class that we have created that is called stored files. So stored file, as I've told you earlier, that it is considered a DBMS or a database management system. So this is basically my interface with the database. This is my interface with each one of these data files. So I can have a data file for accounts, and I can have a data file for movies, and I can have a data file for reservation. Let's take a look at what my movie should have. Let's say that I have a movie. This movie can have a movie ID, a movie name, a movie description. So I can store the data like something like that in my database. I can store like this list of dictionaries, and this dictionary, which is a row in a table of the table movies, right? So this row has a movie ID, it has a movie name, it has a description, actors and years and whole numbers, right? We can just neglect this for the time being, okay? So bottom line is that if you have an entity class, as you're going to see when we refactor this into ECB, we have entity, controller, and boundary. An entity or model, if you're going to talk about MVC, model from MVC, or E from entity from ECB, which is the entity, are the same thing. So model or entity refers to the things that gets stored in your system. What gets stored in my system? The account information. So typically I'll need an account class. What other thing gets stored in my system? Movies. So typically I would need a movies class, right? Right? What other things get stored in your system? Well, reservations needs to be stored and tracked in my system. So I should have a class for reservation. Like this, right? So all of these classes have data that actually corresponds to each of these data files, each of these JSON files, right? So movies entity corresponds or has data that is being stored inside movies JSON, and reservation entity has data that actually is stored inside the reservation JSON, and the account has data that is being stored inside the account's data.json or the data.json, right? So I'm just going to leave this or delete this for the time being. Bottom line, what I'm saying is that each of these entity classes have data stored for them, right? But the rule number one in object-oriented is that you do not put these data files directly inside the entity class. Like we do not read the data from there. Like we do not go to the data.json, for example, and I do not read the data from there or load the data from there. If you do not understand what load is, please watch the essential video about dictionaries. So if I want to read these data or load these data into an actual variable, I can do that, but I will not do that inside this class. Like I would not read or load the values from account data.json and store it directly into the entity class. Instead, I'm going to load the data from account data.json and store it inside an object of stored file, right? And once we have that data from account data.json stored in that object or stored files object, then I can interact with the account, right? Then the account can actually interact with the object that has its data, that has the account data, right? So I'm going to show you an example just in a minute that's going to make things a little bit clearer if you can understand this. But bottom line is, if you have multiple entity or multiple model classes that are associated, or in some sort of way they need to be associated with data files in the database, we do not make like direct association. We do not make like direct link like this. We do not make a direct link with the file, but instead we make a link with the interface. We make a link with the interface for that file. Okay, so how can we interact with the file? We do not interact with the file directly, but we use a gateway to interact for that file for me. We use a gateway that interact with that database or that table inside the database for me. Okay, so that gateway for me is what we call a database management system, or a DBMS, which does typically the normal things that anyone who wants to interact with the file can do. Like if I want to interact with the file, I would want to read from that file, right? I would want to update that content of that file. I would want to write some new stuff in that file. I would want to search in that file, right? So it's the same concept. That is the main point of having a gateway or a database, what we call management system, or a database handler, if you may say, right? So this, sometimes you can see it called something like database interface, right? Which is basically, this is my gateway into accessing, if I am the account class, so this is my gateway to accessing the accounts.json. If I am a movies class, then this is my gateway to access the movies.json file, right? If I am the reservation class, then this is my gateway to access the reservation.json data file, right? So sometimes people are going to call it DB interface, or sometimes people are going to call it which stands for database access object. Okay, it stands for database access object, and some people actually call this database access layer. Okay, so this is the layer that we use in order to interface or to interact with our data files like that, in a way that we do not actually get to interact with that file directly from the entity to the file. There is no direct interaction. That's wrong. Okay, so many things can happen in a very bad or unexpected behavior if you did this direct connection between the entity and the file itself. So you need some sort of a handler, some sort of a gateway, some sort of an interface for that actual file that you can interact with. It's something like, it's saying that I'm the big boy here. If you want to interact with any of these files, you need to instantiate an object from me first, right? So the account needs to instantiate an object from that access layer in order to access data.json. If we have movies class, then the movies class or the movies entity class needs to create an object of that access layer to access the movies.json. If we have a reservation class, then the reservation class needs to create an object of that access layer in order to access the reservation.json. Whether the movies or the reservation class wants to read from that reservation.json, or whether the reservation class wants to write or update stuff in the reservation.json data file, or wants to search stuff in the reservation.json file, etc. Okay, so in order to elaborate on this, I have prepared some simple things. Let's talk about the first part here, which is the login and sign up system. So we're going to talk about the create account, log in and log out, and updating the records or updating the stored file, which is updating these data files. So if I'm talking about account and creating account, then typically I'm talking about updating this data.json or accounts data.json. Okay, now let's go there. Let me just stick to the naming convention that I've used at the beginning. So let's call this stored files like that. All right. What happens is the following. Let's say that data.json or accounts data.json is something like this, like the one that I've showed you earlier, like there. It has a list of dictionaries, and this dictionary corresponds to a row in a table in a database, right? So this row corresponds to a customer or a client, this row corresponds to another user, and so on. So in this row you have multiple variables, and these same variables will be found into the entity account class. Like in the database, I have value for username, password, email, and reserved movies, and the same values you can actually check them in the entity class or the account class, like that. Okay, and the same thing if I talked about when I talked about the movies.json. In the movies.json, as I showed you, it has a movie ID, name, description, actors, and year, and every movie record has the same set of variables. And whenever you take a look, like it's the same thing here, this is the movies.json. Okay, whenever you take a look on the actual movies entity class, you're gonna see that the same variables are existent in the database are inside the actual class. Okay, but the point is, if I am an account entity class, I do not interact with that file directly. No, instead I interact with the gateway or the interface for that file. So this is the database interface. This is the data file or the database interface. So if you want to interface with that file, you want to interact with that file, you should use the gateway, which is the stored file. So what is that stored file? We are seeing something that we haven't talked about for a while now. We are seeing something new here. We are seeing a variable that is called memory. I'm just calling this memory. It's my own choice of words, right? So what is memory? Memory typically is going to be the variable inside the created object of that stored file that is going to have the actual data from this accounts.json. If I created or if I passed this data.json into stored file when I'm creating that stored files, right? So let me rephrase. I can create an object of stored files, and that object based on the file that is being passed, right? Again, based on the file that is being passed, stored file object can have the accounts.json, right? Or based on the account or based on the stored file that is being the stored file object that is being created, it can have also based on the file that is being passed to it, it can have something like movies.json, right? So this is just a container, and this is the object is being created from stored file. So if I'm dealing with account, I need to send the account an object of stored files. Okay, that object of stored file is going to contain the data that are existent inside the accounts.json or data.json. Okay, once I create this object of stored files, and notice that I am passing into that object while I'm creating it, I'm passing the actual data.json, right? Once this object is created, the memory variable here, this is the actual variable that is going to get assigned to the content of the file that is being passed. Okay, so the file here, which is data.json, that is being passed into the object that has been created of stored file. Let's say that this is object 1, for example. We can call it stored file object 1 or accounts. We can call it anything. But bottom line is that this object that we have created from stored files actually contain the data from accounts.data.json or accounts.data.json, right? So what happens is that if the account entity is trying to access anything in the data.json, and instead of this, it's going to use the object of stored files that we have sent to it, right? And it's going to access the memory variable in that object, right? Which is going to be including all of these data inside data.json. Okay, this is the indirect way of communication. Okay, and this is emphasizes on the point that we want to make things a little bit less coupling, because if I included directly without this gateway, if I included the data.json inside the account, inside the entity class directly, this is what we call high coupling, right? So the class is highly coupled with that data.json. What if the data.json that is inside the account class happened to get the file gets deleted, or the file gets corrupted, or the file gets virused, for example? Then this whole class will stop working. So in highly coupled systems, you're gonna see that if someone breaks, if some file or some class breaks, the other class that are dependent on it actually will break as well. So to make things a little bit less coupled, this is what we do. We use the gateway here. So we create an object of that gateway. Again, I'm just rephrasing this for the last time. I know that this has been repetitive, but let's say in the case of account entity class, I'm creating an object from stored files. Okay, so I'm creating an object of stored files. Any object of stored files that is being created will receive a file. It's going to receive any data file. For example, it can receive a data.json file. It can receive a movies.json file. So what do we do when that file is being sent to that object? What should we do with that file? Actually, we load or we read that data from that file and store it inside memory. Okay. After we store it inside the memory variable, now the object is created, and the memory variable in that object that has been created from stored files contain all of the data of the past file. It contains all of the data of the file that we have passed into stored files when we were creating this object. And then this object is going to be sent to the entity class that corresponds to the actual file that we want to interact with. Okay, in this case, I want the account to interact with account.data.json. And so, in order to do this interaction, in order to read stuff from there, in order to write stuff into that, I'm going to use that past object, that stored file object that contains the actual data of the accounts.json inside its memory. Okay? And the same goes if we wanted to create an interface for the movies.json. Like, what if I have a movies entity class, right? And I want to access the movies.json if I want to check some movies inside the database, if they exist or not. If I want to add some movies into the database, which is basically is represented into movies.json. This is my database file. Okay. So if I wanted to have this interaction with the movies.json, I need to create an interface between me, the movies class, and the movies.json database file, right? So this is the interface that we are going to create. This is the class stored files. So I'm going to create an object of that interface that is going to work as a middleman between me as an entity class and the actual data file, right? So I'm going to create an object of stored files that is called stored files object 2. It can be called movies, by the way, right? And I'm going to dump all of the data that is inside JSON, movies.json, into the memory variable, into the memory instance variable of that object that is being created. And then I'm going to take that object and pass it into movies. So if movies now want to check something into movies.json, it doesn't need to have a direct association or a direct link to the actual database file. No, instead it can access the interface object that we have sent it from this stored files class, right? So this interface object will contain the memory, which basically corresponds to the content of the file that we have passed into that class at the point of object creation. Right? So one more time to finalize everything, whenever we create an object of stored files, we are going to pass a specific file. That specific file that is being passed, we take its content and place it into the memory variable. And after an object is being created, whether the object is being created based on accounts data.json or the object that has been created based on movies.json, regardless, that object is sent to the specific entity that will deal with that data file indirectly, right? So that object, if we created an object, an interface object for the database, or a database handler object that is going to handle accounts.json, then we are going to send it typically to account class. If we created an object of the database handler that is going to handle movies.json, then we are going to send it to the movies entity class. All right.